Welcome back to World War II TV, folks. And as we will find out during this series, the Monte Cassino campaign, the wider campaign, was truly international. But battling through the Liri Valley were the Canadians, and there was only one person we would bring on to talk about their role. Prolific author and YouTube regular Mark Zuehlke is back. He's going to talk about that battle. His book on the Liri is in the description below, part of the fantastic Canadian battle series. And I'll bring him in now. Good morning where you are. How are you today, Mark?
Very good. Nice to be here, Paul.
So the Monte Cassino, okay, just before we bring your PowerPoint up, it is very international. Does that, as a historian, make it complicated? I mean, obviously your focus is always the Canadians. You're not trying to tell everybody's story, but does it mean that there's lots of directions you can go when they're researching?
Yeah, and it is very complicated. When you think about it, it's not just the multitude of units and nationalities that's involved. It's the sheer duration of the campaign, just January to June, basically, of 1944. Our role being relatively short, mid-April to the beginning of June, because we were over on the eastern flank of Italy, fighting in the Adriatic and in Ortona. But yes, the Canadian role is a little more diverse because the first Tank Brigade was First Canadian Armored Brigade, I should say, was fighting alongside the Indian divisions of the 8th Army. So not with the Canadians themselves. They supported the Indian divisions in winning the way across the Gari River. And then, we get up into the Liri Valley. We got French to the left of us, and again, British and Indian troops to the right of us. So there is this, when you're doing the research, you're constantly bumping into, where are the lines of advance and who's bumping into who, and how were they deconflicting? So that they didn't end up shooting at each other, which was always a concern when you have nationalities coming up alongside each other's flanks. So
it does get complicated, And the other thing is, of course, the label of Monte Cassino. I mean, I am the nard. Do I call this the Italy spring to summer? Do I call it Monte Cassino? But the thing is, Monte Cassino is just that it's a recognizable brand. People kind of get ice. I know what that was about. And although some of the discussions we'll be having this month don't really concern the monastery and the hill at all, that has become the label, and it's a convenient hook to bring people in. But as I said, we're going to be talking more about the valley, but we'll bring up your PowerPoint.
The Monte Cassino is very much, it's the iconic piece of the puzzle, and even the Canadians, we were fighting just down the hill from it, up the valley. It was constantly there. Every time they looked to the right, the ruins were there of the casino, and great footage you had at the beginning there showing the destruction of the casino, or the abbey. So that was good. But I wanted to bring up this slide because it's showing actually the Canadians. This is when the Canadians started to move from the Adriatic across the Apennines to get to the Liri Valley, their start points in the Liri Valley operations. And it was a fairly, you can see the road is pretty primitive, to say the least.
Is an interesting term there,
yeah. And so it was a slow undertaking. It took them more than a day. Nowadays, you can drive across the Apennines on these routes in about an hour or two. So a big change. This one, the thing is, when we left and came over to the West Coast, a deception program was put into place to fool the Germans about what we were doing. And so we had about 120 radio operators like this chap who went down to the area around Salerno and started broadcasting as if there was an entire Canadian division down there. And the trick was they got the Germans thinking that we were going to do a second Anzio on them, that the Canadians and an American division, which was also down, faked to be down there, it wasn't really there. Again, just a bunch of radio operators, doing everything they could to make it look like they were getting together with convoy ships and stuff and going to head up north of Anzio and land pretty much directly across from Rome. It was a fairly successful operation because the Kesselring did kind of believe it could be possible, and so he moved a couple divisions away from the Cassino front. So that was good for us. 1st Canadian Corps has now come into play. We were originally just a division of Canadians in Italy, the 1st Canadian Infantry Division. They fought through Sicily, then they fought up into Ortona, which is one of our most famous battles for the Canadians in World War II. And after Ortona, there had been discussion always about what was going to happen with the Canadians in Italy. There had been a lot of discussion about actually bringing them back to England so that they would be part of the eventual invasion of France. But that decision was overridden largely because of a lack of transport. It was going to require an enormous amount of shipping to move the Canadians back. It was also going to create a hole in the British 8th Army that would then have to be filled. And so instead, the reverse decision was made that rather than reducing the number of Canadians, we would inflate the number of Canadians in Italy. So all of 1st Canadian Corps now moves down to Italy in December, January. So December 1943, January 1944. So the Corps is now 1st Canadian Infantry Division, 5th Canadian Armored Division, and then the Corps headquarters operations. So you've got about 50,000 Canadians now in Italy fighting, and they're under command of this chap, Lieutenant General Tommy Burns. Burns was quite a character. He was extremely conservative World War I veteran. He had a very dour way about him. The troops called him Smiling Sunray or Laughing, or what was the other one? Laughing Boy was the other one they called him, because of course he never did. Yeah. He barely smiled at all. He was very rigid, kind of into uniforms and proper dress and everything. And as a result, he fits incredibly badly into the ranks of the 8th Army, because the British 8th Army under Montgomery had a very careless way of dressing. They didn't care about what the uniforms looked like. Look at Monty. He's never in a regulation uniform. He's got his tanker's beret, and he wasn't even a tanker, but what the heck? Yep. All that kind of stuff. And so also his divisional commanders have been in Italy for quite a while. They've been fighting alongside 8th Army, and they've adopted a lot of the 8th Army practices. And as a result, there's a clash right away between his Major General Chris Vokes of the 1st Division and Major General Bert Hoffmeister, who's the 5th Armored Division commander. Hoffmeister, of course, came ashore in Sicily commanding the Seaforth Highlanders of Canada, so started as a battalion commander, and in very short order becomes the 2nd Infantry Brigade commander through the fighting in Ortona, and is now the divisional commander of 5th Canadian Armored Division. So literally in 7 months goes from lieutenant colonel to major general. Probably one of the most rapid promotional step forwards that we've seen. The first actions that the Canadians fought were fought not by the Corps, but actually by 1st Canadian Armored Brigade. And the 1st Canadian Armored Brigade provided the tank support for the 8th Indian Division. In their assault on the Gari River, which Americans usually call the Rapido. Yep. There's different disagreements about which it is. The British and Canadians called it the Gari. And so the Americans had failed to win the crossings over that river a month before. and had suffered extremely heavy casualties that led to even a Senate investigation after the war. So the British managed to get across. We developed got some bridges across, and this is where an interesting Canadian story comes in. There was a guy called Kingsmill who was an engineer, and he designed a bridge that effectively they took the turret off of a Sherman tank and put a bridge on it, and then it was hooked to another tank in the front, and they went into the Gari River, the one tank, and down, and then the second tank behind shoved the bridge into place on top of that turret, and the guys inside then swam out in a rather scary undertaking and managed to get to the shore. Kingsmill, the bridge was then called the Kingsmill Bridge. It lasted a very short period of time. They only managed to get 4 tanks across before it was knocked out. But those 4 tanks make the difference. The Americans, when they tried to get across, never got the bridges in place and were never able to bring any armor across, so there was no tanks. We managed to get tanks across, support him, and then more tanks as the bridges, more and more bridges open up, and the Gari River is crossed at that point. And that's one of the bridges that came along later. And you can see how they were using smoke a lot to obscure these bridges and keep the Germans from seeing them. And after that, so we've won. The British have now opened up the way into the Liri Valley effectively with that assault. So it now falls to our Canadians to lead the charge, if you will, up the Liri Valley. And so I'll bring up a map shortly, but just so you can see it, the Abbey of Cassino, Monte Cassino, is really at the gateway into the Liri Valley. So it's there on the right-hand side, overlooking the valley and dominating the ground. And then you advance up the Liri Valley, eventually breaking out into a direct route to Rome. And this photo shows Major General Chris Vokes briefing his officers for this, 1st Canadian Infantry Division, in an attack that they will call Operation Chesterfield. And this gives you a good idea of the kind of ground that they're moving through. It's not as blasted up as most of these photos show. You generally see far more destruction. So these are photos actually as they're moving into the opening of the Liri Valley. But I like this photo because you get a real sense of the logistical train that's running across the countryside. When you're moving an entire division or an entire corps, it's thousands of vehicles are involved, and they all have to. And the roads, again, you can see very typical roads of Italy at that time. They were mud and dirt, and that very seldom was there a paved road.
That's a good question for you, Mark. Because you mentioned Vokes and you talked about Ortona over. How much of a hangover was there of that experience? Because if you're a Canadian military historian these days, it's one of those battles you kind of have to tackle at the one point. It's the elephant in the room, a bit like Vimy Ridge in the First World War, and people pull it apart, and it's the examination of urban warfare, and things don't go well. But is that more of a modern thing to look back on it, or were people in early 44 in and around the Canadians still haunted by that? Was it something people were talking about, or was it firmly in the past?
No, Ortona seriously impacted 1st Canadian Infantry Division, particularly. You have, after Ortona, you've lost hundreds and hundreds of troops. These were all people who had been training together since 1939, basically. Because when we went through Sicily, we didn't suffer a lot of casualties. Comparative, the fighting was pretty intense, but the casualty rate was surprisingly low. then we get to Ortona, and it's a whole different game. You know, in under a month, you have, you know, a couple thousand casualties. And a lot of those guys are going to be wounded so badly that they're not coming back, and a lot of others, and of course a lot of them died as well. So it changed things. Become very, there's a sort of before Ortona, after Ortona phase for the Canadians in Italy. The battle itself was not that well understood outside of the Canadians in Italy until much, much later. There was a tendency for the 1st Canadian Army Command to treat the Italy contingent as kind of a lost bunch of orphans. They didn't think about them much. They didn't pay much attention to them. They, as the campaign goes on, the 1st Canadian Corps is really struggling to get access to a full range of supply because you want all your supplies going into Normandy and on the Canadian side. And it's same with reinforcements. So we start seeing, you know, less and less troops being made available to go down to Italy. So definitely a change in things. I also think what we see is 1st Canadian Infantry Division becomes a much more professional army unit. 5th Canadian Armored Division is thankfully in the hands of a very professional general in Hofmeister. The Canadian Corps headquarters is in not very capable hands of Tommy Burns, and he does not perform well in the forthcoming Liri Valley campaign, and that is actually noted. What we're attacking towards is a defensive line called the Hitler line, and it's anchored on these things. This is a Panzer term. What they did is they took the German tank turret, the 75 long barrel 75 millimeters, particularly, not Tigers, the Panthers. They took the turret and they put it on a concrete base, and under that base was a cellar, if you will, of where they had their ammunition, where the soldiers hung out and operated from, and the turret could rotate, so it could move. And then they piled all this rubble and rock and everything around it to make it pretty much impermeable. You know, you're not knocking this thing out very easily. And they developed a whole system of that running along across the Liri Valley. And they also had quite a number of 75 millimeter and 88 millimeter guns. And you can see how with this one, how it really dominates the field. And that's pretty much that's a good visual image, because you're pretty much seeing the Liri Valley in a way it is. Basically, a little bit of a saddle kind of structure to it. I'm pretty sure that's the Monte Cassino right in the background there too. It's just the photo cuts it off. But yeah, you can see when we advance coming up towards that gun, there is zero cover. You're completely exposed to their fire for a long range. And so this is a map that shows it. So you can see that blue line on the left-hand side of the screen is, I don't know if my pointer works.
No, your pointer doesn't work, unfortunately. You can just describe.
Okay, the blue line on the left-hand side of the screen is actually showing the Gari River in the Gustav line, which was the first thing. So there's the Gari River. And that's the first checkered marks across the river are the British units. And then when you get to the non-checkered arrows, you see the line of the 1st Canadian Infantry Division advance. And the blue line, the blue squiggly line on the right-hand side of the screen is the Hitler line, which was also called the Senger line. Hitler approved the line being called the Hitler line back in about February 1944. By May 1944, he's not so keen on this idea.
No, but it's not working. Yeah.
It's pretty clear the line's going to get cut. And think of the propaganda victory that the Allies are then handed. So he renamed it the Senger Line after the corps commander of the German army here. And of course, predictably, the Allied propaganda machines, we don't buy it. It remains the Hitler line, and is still called the Hitler line by Canadian historians today. And so you can see, again, if you look at that map, there's no topographic features that are going to help you as an attacker move forward under any kind of cover. So the only solution for going forward is you can walk like this in the wide open and probably get slaughtered, especially as you can see the type of destruction that is happening in the Liri Valley. That's the Abbey up at the top, and the rubble down below is the town of Cassino, which was totally devastated, just blown off the face of the earth, really. It will take about 20 years for the Italians to rebuild all this. It's an incredible rebuilding process. But what we're really thinking about right now is artillery.
Yeah.
Operation Chesterfield required a massive amount of gunnery. We had all of the Canadian guns, and we had a large number, pretty much, actually we had all of 8th Army's 25-pounder artillery available. So it was a massive undertaking. And what they did is they laid down a rolling barrage, which was lifting every 100 yards. Every 5 minutes, it would lift 100 yards and go forward. And the Canadian troops are supposed to advance right behind that, leaning into the barrage, as they called it. Tactic from World War One. Nothing's changed. We got tanks. That's really the one thing that's changed there. But you really, that's what you're working on, is that kind of an attack. And they have to move 2,000 yards forward to get to the Hitler line. And the advance goes really quite well to the Hitler line. And then it becomes a bit of a nightmare, because we saw we saw those panzer terms back there.
Yep.
Yeah, we'll just stay here.
Yeah.
And the panzer terms, for example, it was 2nd Infantry Brigade particularly that got slaughtered at the Hitler line. They were being supported by the North Irish Horse tanks of the British. And the North Irish Horse loses basically every one of its tanks, knocked out by the panzer terms. The infantry get in amongst the positions. They get into the barbed wire. Again, very World War I kind of scenario, and are cut to pieces mostly by machine gun and mortar fire. So they're slaughtered. That attack fails. We do break through the Hitler line eventually over the next day on the left-hand side of where the 2nd Brigade got shot up. 3rd Brigade and 1st Brigade are able to actually fight their way through below a town called Ponte Corvo. And they take so the Hitler line is then breached. It's a big victory for us, because there had been an expectation that it might fail. The whole attack, the Canadians would not succeed, and because it was the fighting in the open there. And you can see in this map, which is the breakout from the Hitler line, you can see the French are over on the bottom part of the map. Again, you can see the checkered arrows are British units that are up in the a lot of sort of there's a heights of ground that come up towards the Apennines, the foothills, if you will. They're mostly fighting up in there. And we're again pushing up through the middle to push towards another line, which is anchored on this river that you can see in the middle of the map. And there's a road behind it that runs straight, and that's the Melfa River. And the Germans called that the Green Line, but we tended to call it the Melfa River Line. The attack on the Melfa River was carried out by the 5th Armored Division, and this photo shows Major General Bert Hofmeister briefing his troops, his commanders again, his officers, on what they're going to do, how they're going to carry out the attack. Hofmeister had a tendency, he was not as keen on the heavy artillery fire, let's move forward against rolling barrages and that, as 1st Infantry Division was. And there was a reason for that. 5th Armored Division doesn't have that kind of infantry. It's got 1 brigade of infantry at this point, so three battalions, and then what was called a support battalion, motor battalion in the Westminster Regiment that was motorized and could, in theory, stay abreast of the armor as it goes forward. So really, they've got 4 battalions, and to do that kind of rolling barrage advance, you're likely going to run out of men too quickly. So you want to stay nimble, you want to stay fast, and Hofmeister was great at doing that. He would get the armor moving and keep it rolling. And this is a great photo because it's the Lord Strathcona Horse recce unit arriving at Benedictine Crossroads on the edge of the Melfa River. And there was a guy in there, Perkins was his last name, who was commanding this unit. And his approach was very typical of armored reconnaissance units. Basically, just go hell for leather until somebody stops you, or you get, or you get through to where you want to be. And this picture it was taken literally when they got to where they wanted to be, which is the Melfa River. They dismounted and ran across the river because they couldn't get those little armored cars across, because it's a really crazy little river, the Melfa. It's quite steep banks even today. So they got across, they set up a bridgehead, they carried across, they took all of their heavy machine guns and other firepower out of the armored cars and brought them with them. And they set up a bridgehead. And very shortly, this fellow, Jack Manny, who was with a company of Westminsters, he arrives and brings his men into that bridgehead. And for the next 30 hours, those 2 units are fighting in extremely close contact with the Germans. They're repelling one counterattack after another to hold the ground. The result will be that Jack Manny will be the 2nd Canadian in Italy to earn a Victoria Cross, after Captain Paul Triquet, who got a Victoria Cross for his fighting outside of Ortona at Casa Berardi. Jack Manny was an interesting guy, not your Audie Murphy kind of hero. He had been a newspaper reporter. He was very quiet, somewhat shy, and he gets the Victoria Cross because basically he spends hours just walking the lines of his troops that as they're fighting and encouraging them to keep fighting. And he's exposed to fire all around him, never gets hit, did extremely well. Perkins gets the Distinguished Service Order, and there's been always a lot of debate between the Strathconas and the Westminsters about who should have got the Victoria Cross, which of the two of them. But we do that a lot in Canada with World War II, it seems. It's trying to second guess.
You were a bit stingy with them, it has to be said. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, and so it comes up, and we never have an incident in Canadian history outside of Dieppe where more than one person gets a Victoria Cross. So there were 2 at Dieppe, but it's an exception. This fellow his last name is Thrasher. He and Manny, this tank got right in practically inside the perimeter that the Canadians had set up. So Thrasher and Manny went tank hunting with that Piat gun. And Thrasher knocked the tank out with 1 round from the Piat gun, very accurately fired. And then they, of course, this press posed a photo of him with the machine gun bullets that he didn't have any.
I can just imagine the photographer putting that belter ammo over the barrel there, just kind of adjusting it and going, it needs something else. It needs, it needs an upturned German helmet on the ground, doesn't it? So just top it off.
Yeah. Interestingly, the family of the Thrasher family contacted me a couple years after the book came out and said that they hadn't really known the whole story, but that this photo had been on their father's fireplace mantle for ever and a day. And it was a photo of him. He got killed, unfortunately. He dies up in the river battles up in near the end of the Canadian time in Italy. But anyway, another very brave Canadian soldier. Now, having got through the Melfa River, we're able to start really advancing, and the Canadians are fighting still. You can see again, this is a photo taken north of the Melfa River. I think it's in the village of Frosinone, but I'm not able to confirm that. Again, everything's destroyed. This was probably in Western World War II terms, I think the Cassino battlefield is probably the most heavily demolished area there is. You've got months and months and months of aerial bombardment, artillery bombardment, both sides with the artillery, us with the aerial bombardments going all the time, naval bombardments because it was within Navy range of naval guns. So the devastation was just unreal. And that's sort of it for the slide part of the
Roberto is saying it's the Pontecorvo Road. He's out there right now. He's
in the Roberto!
Right yeah, yes. I know you can know each other. So,
great.
So, brilliant stuff. And there's some more questions for you because, the actions there with Piats and knocking out tanks, it kind of they're the kind of ones that stir the soul, and the bombardment, heavy bombers hitting everything. But does that kind of mask an underlying kind of lack of close air support? Because when they were moving across the valley there, we all know that the spring of 44 leading into the summer, kind of a lot of stuff's being sent back to England, ready for overlord, and they're stripping away assets. Is there a feeling amongst Canadian military historians that some of this was a little bit under supported by some good old fashioned or good modern tech?
Yeah, the air support was always lacking in Italy. And it's partly lacking as well because it starts to get better in August 1944 when the Allies developed what they called the cab rank system, which came about and was enabled by finally getting the ability that people on the ground could talk to the pilots via radio. And we started having what we now call the JTACs and the Joint Task Force Air Controllers in military. We sort of created a primitive version of that. So there were Air Force, usually guys, who were then attached to brigade headquarters, who could actually talk to the pilots and bring them in on targets. We didn't have that until August 1944. Really, you were just hoping that they'd show up, and you could maybe throw some smoke around and say, yeah, drop a bomb here. And sometimes it was weather. The Liri Valley is this interesting problem where it in most mornings, it gets a kind of thick fog, even in May, that it's sort of a mist that just sort of hangs over the valley. And that takes quite a long time to burn off. And so there was that. So the visibility was poor. The Canadians as well, we did a lot of our fighting at night because they'd come to find that the Germans didn't really like fighting at nighttime, in the nighttime. So if you could move forward and get right up into close and personal with them, and then strike the moment dawn starts to emerge, that they would often crumble and fall back because they wouldn't have been thinking about people moving forward at nighttime because they just weren't very comfortable moving around and fighting at night. And we see that in Normandy as well, where the Canadians, we do a lot of our operations at night for that reason. So there was that. And of course, then you can't have air support because you don't have night fighters. But yeah, it's an interesting point. There was never the kind of air support that it would have made a really difference. It doesn't make a difference.
I mean, I think definitely by the time you get to June, and I mean, not that the Normandy campaign wasn't without its own problems, but it does seem that the Allies were kind of saving some of their cool stuff for that Normandy account. And it's like, well, they're in Italy now. They've been doing it, and there's kind of not much change of ideas really since North Africa. Some other hangover. I mean, okay, yes, they had defeated the Germans in North Africa, and yes, Sicily had progressed, but there is new tech coming through, and it does seem sometimes that they're saving all the shiny new stuff for Overlord. Yes, you could make the argument that Overlord is maybe important. We talked about that with Alan Allport, yesterday, the whole context of Monte Cassino, and people are still debating whether or not there was any real need to go up Italy, but that doesn't take it away from the fact that if you're a Canadian soldier in that battle, you might have wanted a little bit more of of the stuff that you're hearing about. But
well, it's true. Like we never. It's the fall of 1944 when the Firefly tank starts showing up in Italy, and we get those. So we didn't, and that's a game changer when you get those because you can actually go head to head with the Tiger. We didn't have those until the fall. We never do get the Kangaroo armored personnel carriers. I see photos on the Facebook sites where of people saying they're kangaroos in Italy, but they weren't. They're kangaroos in Northwest Europe. So you never get that armored personnel carrier capability to go up alongside the armor. So a lot of shortages and real shortages of personnel.
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's not like that there are all these weapons someone's secretly keeping back in a stockpile, and there's lots of units secretly kept in but there just aren't enough to go around. I mean, it's the manpower crisis is kind of at its peak, and things won't really get better again till early 45. But but it does. I can completely understand the reaction of the Italy veteran compared to the France and Germany veteran, of feeling that somehow we're getting second rate and less of everything. But that's kind of understood, I think, by historians. We've got a few more stories for you. So Lisa is asking you, what memoirs and first-hand accounts can Mark recommend to add to my research? On which she's read your books, that she doesn't know that much about the Canadian efforts. So any particular ones from this campaign that you can think of?
Yes, there's a couple wonderful ones. Farley Mowat, of
I knew you were going to say
course.
that. I was going to bet on that.
Yeah, and No Birds Sang is the name of that book. He also wrote one called The Regiment, which is about the Hastings and Prince Edward Regiment that he served with. They're both really good books. Another one that's extremely good is by Fred Cederberg, The Long Road Home.
Right.
And the last one I'll mention is Jerry Sislowski. Not All of Us Were Brave. Jerry was a Perth Regiment soldier, and Fred Cederberg was initially with the Cape Breton Highlanders and then transited over to be a sergeant in the Lanark and Scottish Renfrew Regiment, which was formed after the Liri battle they took an anti-aircraft battalion. Not many German planes around anymore. They said, we don't need those guys on the guns. We'll turn them into infantrymen. And doing this, they did it to two different regiments, gave them the 5th Canadian Armored Division, that 2nd Infantry Brigade that they had lacked in the Liri Valley, and they realized, no, we actually need those. We need that number of men. Very unpopular decision with the anti-aircraft battalion, and the other one was an armored recce battalion, because of course they had not. They were so far away from their training in infantry, anything infantry, that they had to learn literally how to be infantrymen in combat. And so what they did is they brought people like Fred Cederberg over to provide that kind of skill base. And so you get these bizarre situations where Fred is teaching them how to throw grenades at Germans rather than out in training field somewhere. Crazy stuff. But they needed those men badly.
And what's your assessment on how that phasing in went? Because we had American historian Stephen Clay on last week talking about the 1st Division and how in the 7 months they had before Operation Overlord, they went against this idea of don't make friends with the new replacements, and because they're going to get killed first. And they had a real intensive program to bring the new guys in, to phase in alongside the old guys. Is there any kind of single assessment you would make about how the Canadians were they good at it or bad at it, or did it vary from regiment to regiment?
They were really quite good at it. Fred Cederberg's story goes into that quite a lot. Like he, initially he's scared about what he's seeing because he thinks that they're all going to get killed. But he's able to. Those guys are, the thing about Canadians at that time, most of them were country boys. We were not an urbanized culture, particularly units that they were forming from. These guys had grown up in the country. They did know how to hunt and they knew how to shoot. And then they got some infantry training, before they got posted to be a gunner or an armored car driver. So they had some skill set. They just needed to be refreshed in it. And the biggest problem that Fred had was teaching them to dig holes. The slit trenches and that is they weren't doing that for all the time they'd been in Italy up to this point. They didn't have to. They were in the rear. So suddenly now they're having to dig slit trenches, and there's a really classic scene where he's saying, he said, what's the most important weapon I'm holding in my hands? And they all point to his rifle, and he on his other hand, he's holding a shovel. He says, no, it's the shovel. Versus whenever we stop, you dig a hole and you get into it. And so they were able to train them in that. That said, the Lanark and Renfrew Scottish and the other unit, whose name is escaping me right now, the Princess Louise Dragoon Guards, that's who it was, they do suffer quite heavy casualties initially as they are learning that curve. And that's up at the Gothic line on the Adriatic coast in August. So yeah, they do integrate them quite well.
And I think, well, thank you. And I think it's another thing about the Italian campaign is when you look at it in terms of the kind of the army-sized maps, there's a sense that the Allies are constantly at it, and they are. But of course, for the various components of it, there is a bit of a stop-start nature of it. You know, entire divisions have a couple, 2 or 3 weeks here where they're not doing much. Then they get, I mean, in the case of the Canadians, they get shifted from the Adriatic coast towards the middle again. And does that? I think we talked about this last time, but you know, sometimes you can make the argument that keeping up that momentum of being in action all the time kind of keeps your skill sets up, and then too many gaps in between combat, you lose that that ability. But then you also need a break. So have you got any kind of assessment on that kind of stop-start nature? It's like, you know, like in sport, people say the biggest thing is momentum, isn't it? You start winning, and winning breeds more winning. In studying that campaign, it is stop-start, isn't it?
Yeah, so after the Liri Valley fighting, for example, we are advancing, but the Canadians, we sort of move out of the operational thing. The Americans and the British are leading it for a ways. And so then 1st Division goes to Florence. And it's just a holding position. The Germans are inside the city, and we're on the opposite side of the Arno River from them. And people are just holding. And there's a little bit of sniper activity, a little bit of raiding back and forth between the Germans and Canadians. But it's considered a completely quiet front in terms of the way the war is going. So that lasts for about 3 weeks. And then there's the getting ready, and off we go to fight the Gothic line back over in the Adriatic. In 1944, late 1944, November, the Canadians are brought out of the line up by south of Ravenna, where they've been fighting in the river battles, and are given basically a month, almost a month break, where they're not to partly to rebuild. They've suffered a lot of casualties, a lot of disorganizations happened, and so you need time to get out of the field, put new command structures together, new officers, because officers have been killed and everything, and or wounded or replaced for incompetency. That happens too. And you know, so they needed to rebuild. And yes, I think that it's not totally a loss of skill set, but I think what gets lost is that kind of state of edginess.
I thought edge, just,
you know, and then you know, do you start making more mistakes personally as a result of that? Because you come back into the field, and then it's like, you know, you got all of those things you've learned that have kept you alive. You got to kind of make sure you're back on that game. You know, it's sort of like I talked to an Afghan Canadian veteran just recently for a project I'm working on. And, you know, he was talking about like going from every day when you were in a vehicle, going down a road, expecting there to be an IED or an ambush. And then you get back to Canada and you're in your car and you're supposed to drive like a normal person. It was how you know, he's wanting to, you know, keep varying the speed and going this way and literally having to relearn how to be a civilian. And so these guys, they go out of the line, they kind of spend a little while kind of being a civilian again, and then they go back into the line and they have to say, oh no, I'm actually a soldier.
Complicated. And Norma Graham is talking about the complication of keeping morale up, because when you're in combat, you kind of want to be out of combat. And I'm guessing that when you're out of combat, then the griping starts, then the grumbling starts. You almost kind of wish you went back into combat. It's like the guys in the bomber command. You know, you don't want to be flying, but the gap in between flying is almost worse than getting into the aircraft and doing the flying, because the anticipation and the nerves kicking, and it's that complicated. We've got a couple more questions for you. Well, firstly, Amy is saying that you're a national treasure. Your books have helped me understand the aspects of the Italian campaign that my grandpa would not speak of. So there you are, a vote for you as a national treasure.
Well, thank you very much.
That's very nice. And Murdio Lou is saying, when is your Channel Ports book coming onto Kindle? It's the only one he hasn't got. So do you happen to know whether that's on Kindle?
I would have thought it would be on Kindle. I'll have to look into that.
Okay, well, and that's and then a longer one from Peter is about the complexity. We talked about it earlier of the the international flavor. So, we just talked about morale, we talked about the edge, but he's saying, did the complex national and ethnic composition of the Commonwealth forces and the hardships they all experienced cause tensions between them? So, over to you.
The interesting one on that is the Canadian Armored Brigade. So 1st Canadian Armored Brigade was taken away from the 1st Canadian Corps, and they served continuously with other Commonwealth forces, largely Indian divisions. And reading their accounts of that of their supporting the Indian divisions, they actually loved working with them. They were fighting alongside Gurkhas, they were fighting alongside regular Indian divisions, and they found them very good to work with. They then, up by Lake Trasimene, they got switched to a regular British division, and there were some real teething problems. The infantry, the tankers felt that the infantry didn't understand what tanks were supposed to be doing. And so there was friction at that point. But that's a complex conflict of arms in a way.
I mean, that's kind of a universal problem, isn't it? You see that in Normandy, you see it in Burma. It's doctrine based as well, isn't it? In that, people would pop watching this from a modern serving today would say there's still a complication combining different arms together into a fluid response. But
exactly.
And then my last one really is going to be about, in a couple of decades or more, you've been studying the Italian campaign. Is your thinking about the campaign changing? Is there historiography? Is there a new field of study about the Italian? People. We talked about the Vimy Ridge and Ortona and Australians, it's Gallipoli and certain things. But is the Italian campaign going through a renaissance of interest?
Yeah. So when I first got into it, the Italian campaign was the great big dark hole in Canada. It has changed. There's other historians who are getting involved in looking at the Canadian role in Italy. I think there's an understanding now that the D-Day Dodgers, as they were referred to themselves as, after being slagged by Lady Astor.
Not her finest hour.
Exactly. I think what we're getting in the development of historiography on this is that the campaign itself did play an important role. It wasn't just a sideshow.
Yeah.
It drew an enormous amount of German divisions and fighting power away from Normandy, away from the Russian front. It was that second front quite a long time before the so-called second front got opened with the invasion of Normandy. And so we're seeing that what the Canadians did and what all the units did that served in Italy is they did play a vital role in the course of the war. Had the Germans not been tied down in Italy, what would have happened with all those divisions that would have gone? And that's the big unknown question.
Yeah, it's very hard to sell the idea of the attritional aspect. We can look at lots of campaigns in World War II, but look at the attrition of the enemy there. But at the time, it's hard to it seems, I think if I was a Canadian or British soldier, I'd feel that was something of an abstract comment. If someone said to me, but it's not about victory, it's about attrition. But we can now, with the 80 years we have, say that, sure, all these campaigns were wearing down the Third Reich on every side. But they've been a hard sell for a veteran.
And it wasn't, it does become attrition after the Gothic line. Up until then, there was this sort of hope, we can break through and maybe bust out into Austria and become a real game changer. And then it just peters away because we're not strong enough. Too many American divisions have been taken away and sent to Normandy and in the move into southern France and up. And it's not going to happen. There's just not the strength, to do that. So now all we can do is hold the Germans in place. And to do that, you have to keep fighting your way forward.
Yeah, no, great answer. And then Paul Scott is saying, tell Mark, thanks for including the story of my dad, Trooper A.G. Scott at Torres Crossroads, made my heart jump when I saw it. So there
thank you.
So that's another thank you there. He didn't say that you're National Treasure, though. So we'll have to have him do another comment and say we have 2 votes for National Treasure. It'll be great. But, I think it's glad that I'm glad that we're looking at Italy now. And I mean, Italy gets the forgotten label. Burma has had the forgotten label. I think with the generation of historians we have now, there is no battlefield that's truly forgotten. Some are looked at a bit more than others. Normally, I'm looking at you, says the man living there. And, there's the perennial books on dam busters and the Malta convoys and Arnhem. But I think there aren't really many truly forgotten battlefields now. They are all getting the interest because I think there's a breed of historians who now have more access to archives and files, and they can spread their wings a little bit more. So it's really good.
I agree, and I think there's just a whole, in Canada, we've had a real upsurge in young people studying military history. So there's more people going to the schools, and then they get they get interested and they want to do stuff, and they write new books, and being young, they bring a different perspective. They start seeing things that people like myself don't see.
Well, that's the revolution, and I mean, it's. I was talking to John Buckley a few months ago at the Wolverhampton course in the UK, and he was saying that when he's bringing lots of modern people for his courses now, they don't come with the determined ideas about Montgomery and Patton and Kesselman because they haven't necessarily heard of these people. It's our generation who we grew up with these as figures in the background, and people are taking in some ways a more objective view. They're freed from the constraints of our perceptions. I can't help the fact that all through my 5, 6, 7 years that I was reading comics, which gave me a very brilliant but warped view of the war. I thought the Australians were all bare-chested guys with with tattoos out in North Africa, and but it's the younger people are drawing from a different set of experiences, and I think it's allowing for a freedom of they're not restricted by some of the stuff I was growing up, but it's brilliant stuff. I always like talking to you, Mark. We'll have to bring you back later in the year when we get up to the Gothic line in the winter.
Sure.
You're over in Normandy in a few weeks' time. Maybe we'll bump into each other. That'd be really nice. It's been a long time since I've bumped into you in person. Juno, I think was it the year the Juno Center opened? I think I met you.
It was either the year it opened or the year after. Yes,
which is now a lot longer in the past than I care to remember.
Long time, yeah.
Anyway. Folks, we're back in tomorrow talking to a fantastic Monte Cassino local who does tours there about her experiences taking veterans around and how the battlefield has changed over the last 20 years. That'd be fantastic. So thank you, everybody, for your fantastic questions. Thank you, Mark, for joining us. Folks, enjoy the rest of your day, and I will see you all again tomorrow. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye.